Hi everyone, my name is Michaela and I'll be giving you a brief run through on critical thinking and everything that comes along with it. So this is our agenda for today. You may notice that we skipped through a chapter, but since this is a crash course, it is necessary not to overwhelm you with too much information. So in each chapter, we will become more knowledgeable about each factor that contributes to critical thinking. This slide gives us the definition of critical thinking, which simply means to become an effective judge of what you should believe and exercising careful judgment. Time to get started. Chapter 1, Facts, Opinions, and Knowledge. So first is facts. What are facts? Facts are out there with or without knowledge of them. There are even facts that nobody knows. And it's something that's true, whether anyone knows it or not. Opinions. We all have them, right? But in philosophy, opinions are just beliefs that someone has about something. Some are true and some are false. Knowledge. We all have some form of knowledge, of course. But in philosophy, when a belief is both true and justified, that is knowledge. You should be able to explain why an answer is the right answer, because this is a crucial part of critical thinking. You should also be able to reflect critically on the beliefs you already have to figure out which ones are mistaken or unjustified. Before believing something, critical thinkers ask themselves whether they have good reasons to accept the belief. Chapter 2, Justification. What is it, and what does it have to do with critical thinking? There are 5 ways to justify a belief: definition, perception, testimony, authority, and reasoning. So again, we ask, what is justification? So justification is believing something because it's true by definition, having some sort of evidence to support that belief. The first one we'll talk about is justification by perception, believing something because we've seen it to be true with our own eyes, or heard it, felt it, smelled it, or even tasted it ourselves. For example, the Earth is round. We have seen many photos showing that the Earth is round. Or even bacon. It comes from pigs. This has been proven. Justification by testimony. So this is taking someone's word for it. Not all testimony is strong or trustworthy, but if it comes from someone who is an expert in the topic, you might consider the testimony to be reliable. Justification by authority. Sometimes we learn things from people who know what they're talking about, even though they didn't perceive it themselves. This relies on someone who can speak with authority on a particular subject. Next, we have justification by reasoning. It's justifying a specific belief by giving convincing reasons for it. Chapter 3, Reasoning. Here we start out by learning about argument. An argument is a chain of reasoning, nothing to do with today's terminology, that means to have a verbal fight. Every argument has 2 statements. They have premises, which are statements that are meant to count as reasons. The first 2 statements, reasons the author gives you to justify the conclusion. And they also have a conclusion, statements that they're reasons for. The last statement, the author or speaker is trying to justify or convince you. When analyzing an argument, it means taking it apart to see what the premises are, what the conclusion is, and how the premises are supposed to justify the conclusion. One important skill in learning to use arguments is recognizing and analyzing other people's arguments. Analyzing an argument means taking it apart to see what the premises are, what the conclusion is, and how the premises are supposed to justify the conclusion. To analyze an argument, you look for indicator words. On the last slide, we heard about indicator words. So these are particular words or phrases that writers use to introduce premises or conclusions. Examples: because and since indicated you're about to read a premise. Therefore and so indicates a conclusion. A subconclusion is some of the statements are acting as both premises and conclusions. It's a statement that fulfills both roles in an argument. Identifying premises as foundations of arguments is important to analyzing given statements, but we can also treat general principles and abstract theories as premises for finding philosophical conclusions and real-life practical solutions. Chapter 5, Reasoning about Better and Worse. So in this slide, we learn about descriptive statements first. So these are statements about the way things are, were, or would be under certain circumstances. So an example of this is the movie Titanic is based on true events, whereas Romeo and Juliet is fictional. Normative statements, these are statements about what is good or bad, about how things should be, or about who should do what. We can even say that someone is justified, or not, in believing some normative statement based on the strength of his or her reasons for believing it. When evaluating arguments with normative premises, be sure to ask yourself whether you have good reason to accept the normative premises. This is especially important when you're already inclined to accept the argument's conclusion, since that makes it tempting to be less critical of the premises. For example, the Titanic was a better love story than Romeo and Juliet. Evaluative statements. These are used to describe statements about what is good or bad. So arguments for normative statements must meet all the same criteria as arguments for descriptive statements. The premises must be reliable, relevant to the conclusion, and collectively strong enough to support the conclusion. In other words, if you're going to argue for a conclusion about something being good or bad or right or wrong, you'll need at least one premise about what's good or bad or right or wrong. This is because you need a normative premise to connect the descriptive premises to the normative conclusion. That is, to show that the descriptive premises are relevant to the conclusion. So here we've reached the final chapter, Chapter 6, Asking for Reasons. Principle of charity. You should interpret someone else's arguments and statements in whatever way makes them strongest or most reasonable. When someone makes an argument that could be interpreted in more than one way, you should interpret it in a way that makes it as strong as possible. And when someone makes a statement that could be interpreted in more than one way, you should interpret it in the way that makes it most reasonable or most likely to be true. Next, we have charitable interpretation. So an interpretation that makes an argument or statement seem as strong or reasonable as possible. Uncharitable interpretation. This is one that makes it seem particularly weak or unreasonable. You should know that the principle of charity has several more specific implications. Adopting the following 3 practices will help you apply the principle of charity, not only in conversations or classroom discussions, but also in one-sided forms of communication, such as when you're reading or watching someone's arguments. Here we have the 3 practices to follow for the principle of charity. 1. Confirm you've understood the statement and try to find possible reasons one might have for believing it. 2. Look for hidden premises if the argument seems too weak to support its conclusion. And 3. When you find fallacy, take a closer look to see if you can find a good argument behind the mistake. I would like to thank you all for joining me today through this crash course. I hope I have helped to give a better understanding of critical thinking. Bye, everyone.